if you could, in 3 to 4 minutes tops, explain your organizations and the Republican Party's positions on gun control at the present time, if you could, just in general.
Well, overall, I think everyone knows that the Republican Party is in favor of gun rights. We basically summed up, we want law-abiding citizens to not have their rights infringed upon. Of course, we don't want guns in the wrong hands. I think that the two sides just have different ideas on going about how we keep our communities safe from gun violence. Do you want anything?
To expand upon that, I think a lot of what the GOP draws from is that our constitutions come with a basic philosophical premise. And that premise is that each person is granted some sort of God-given rights that they would have in a state of nature. And those God-given rights can be anywhere from a range of freedom of speech to being able to have the right to self-preservation, defend yourself. And the Second Amendment right, the premise behind the Second Amendment and gun rights is that the GOP believes we have a natural right to self-preservation, and beyond that, we have an option in case the government were to ever turn tyrannical, as democratic governments and non-democratic governments have displayed that they can do throughout the history of humanity. So that's my basic premise there.
All right, thank you, College GOP. Now, College Democrats, if you could give a short synopsis of your organizations and perhaps the Democratic Party's basic position on gun control at the present time, or gun rights in general.
Well, first off, thank you Campus Life, thank you UNCW for allowing us to give the opportunity to speak about this issue. Gun safety to UNCW College Democrats and Democrats across America. I just want to be clear, we're not trying to take anyone's guns away from them. We just simply want comprehensive, common sense safety to keep Americans safe and also to keep your constitutional rights.
If I could add, the National Democratic Party and the National Republican Party, no one's really quite sure what we're going to do about these issues. That's why we're having these debates. That's why we're talking to one another. No one has an idea. They have plans maybe, but there's no legislation being drawn up right this minute. So the biggest point of it is that these discussions are necessary, and discussions between both sides. We can't just throw each other under the table and say, like, well, I can't respect you because you're going to do this. Instead, we should have the conversation. We should start pitching ideas and work together to come up with a solution, because all in all, we care about Americans, and we care about Americans' lives, and we care about Americans' rights. So we both care about that, both sides. So we need to make sure that we have the conversation and we talk to one another to figure out what's best to save Americans' lives and to uphold the rights that our Constitution has provided to us.
All right, awesome. So the first question, and I'll throw this out to whoever would like to start with it, but so we're all clear about what the Constitution says specifically, because perhaps you don't know. The Second Amendment of the Constitution reads, and I quote, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." Now, in addition to the Second Amendment, there have been several court cases throughout time, and two important ones are Miller, which was in 1934, and then the Heller case, which was in 2009, or it could have been 10. I'm fuzzy on that one, but someone will correct me. But in any event, Antonin Scalia, now former deceased member of the Supreme Court, he wrote in the Heller case that the right to keep and carry weapons, and I quote, "in the common use of the time," is what the Constitution protects. So my question, to open it up to the group, is, given that the understanding is to keep and bear arms in the common use of the time, that's the specific phrase that Justice Scalia used, does that open the door to any regulations, some regulations? What kind of regulations, while keeping in mind the Second Amendment?
In the common use of the times, I know Antonin Scalia was more in favor of the theory that the Constitution is more of a dead document. It's not a living document that morphs as times go on. But I think regardless of what your beliefs in that case are, yes, we're open to regulations. We don't want criminals to have guns. We don't want people who have ceded essentially their right to participate in civilized society to own a firearm. For example, people who have misdemeanor domestic assault convictions, or people who have full-scale domestic assault convictions. We don't want those people getting their hands on guns. And I think that's just a common ground that we can all come to when it comes to regulation, background checks, all that sort of thing. I haven't heard many people on the right argue that there's no room for any sort of gun regulation in this debate. And I've listened to a few prominent people on this issue. So, yeah, of course, we're open to regulation. We're open to instituting regulation.
I think what we, oh, sorry, can I add?
Yes, of course.
I think what we just want to be careful about is not infringing on people's rights to due process. We want to make sure that comes first before taking gun rights away.
Okay.
To the Heller decision, I believe it was 2008.
Wow.
They let Scalia said the common use at the time is a very important point in that I was just reading about forgive me for not remembering what case it was, but the Fourth Circuit of Maryland upheld a assault weapon ban in Maryland on the en banc decision because of the common use argument. They say that military style quote unquote weapons are not common use, and Scalia in his decision says that military style weapons are not common use, and so the Fourth Circuit has decided that decision, Heller decision, upholds the right to an assault weapons ban. And so I think that it holds itself up to more regulation rather than less. That's the common use statement holds itself up to more regulation rather than less, if I could say.
Okay.
Yes, and I also believe, we're going with common use. Like Andy was saying, we're talking about the technology of the guns at the time and the reason for having the guns at the time. The Second Amendment was so vital to our country because you never knew when someone was trying to come at you, or you needed to go hunting or survive, just general survival, or if the government was coming to overthrow you. But I believe the technology has advanced than what the Constitution is talking about, and I also believe the U.S. military has advanced. So if you're scared that the military is going to come and overthrow you, chances are that they probably will, because our military now uses drones and other types of weapons, and your gun probably isn't going to protect you from the U.S. military at this time.
I would debate against that point. The U.S. military is scattered all over the world. It's been involved in conflicts throughout human history in which people with lesser guns, people with less technology, people who are less advanced simply can't be controlled by the U.S. military. There's a reason why we're still in Afghanistan. There's a reason why we still need to hold a presence in Iraq. There's a reason why we had to pull out of Vietnam. Especially in the case of Vietnam, it wasn't a full-out, all-scale war. It was a partial war in which, full resources weren't dedicated to the conflict. I doubt that the U.S. government is going to go into, let's say there's some sort of uprising. People don't want to be, there's a tyrannical government, people don't want to be taken away. I doubt the U.S. government would resort to drone striking cities and destroying the very infrastructure that it needs to thrive. There have been lesser advanced groups throughout human history that not only resist, but eventually triumph over more advanced military forces. So I think just saying, you should cede your Second Amendment right, or not even cede your Second Amendment right. You should take your Second Amendment right and your ability to fight off a tyrannical government less seriously, because said tyrannical government is advanced. I just don't think that's a stable point to be going off of.
So, anybody else? Or do you want to respond really quickly?
Well, no one is trying to take the Second Amendment away, and that's just really gets misconstrued. And I believe that the technology we're talking about, even the technology they used in Vietnam, ARs are considered more powerful than the technology they used in Vietnam, just because of the weight, the capacity, and just no one is trying to take the Second Amendment away. That was not what I was trying to construe.
Oh, and I understand. It's an argument that I often hear. You know what I mean? And I'm not saying that you're saying it. It's just the argument is, why should you care about your Second Amendment rights? Why should you think that you can not even overthrow, but resist a tyrannical government if that government is so much more advanced than you? And the fact is, if you need a few things in order to properly resist a tyrannical government. One, you need a well-armed populace, obviously. The second thing is you need a populace that values the rights that they've been bestowed. We value our right to free speech. We value our rights to religious liberties. We value our right to to defend ourselves. mixing the American populace being so well armed with its value of with its cultural values and valuing its rights so deeply. I don't think it's the best argument when people say, but the military is so advanced.
If I could add in, so this is bringing me to an interesting second point. So Pew, which some of you may be familiar with, Pew has some great data. They have longitudinal data from the 1990s. Of course, there was an assault weapons ban. The Brady Bill was passed in 1994. Was in place for 10 years. It had a sunset clause in it. It went away in 2004. The Republican majorities in Congress and President Bush did not want to reauthorize it, so it just sort of faded away. And so in 2000, when Pew did a survey, which is right in the middle of the Brady Bill's existence, in 2000, they found that 29% of people supported the right to own a gun, whereas in that same survey in 2000, 67% of the respondents said that they supported more gun control. So the question was, would you rather have more liberty to have a gun or more gun control? Clearly the balance of those survey respondents were in favor of more gun control in 2000. By 2017, same survey question, 47% of people said that they were more supportive of the right to own a gun, compared to only 51% of people who said they supported more gun control. So over the intervening years, obviously the country has been much more evenly divided on that question. And so my question, which is sort of indicated by some of the conversation we're having, is, given that this is such a tightly contested issue on either side, people say more gun control or more liberty to have a gun, how can we see a pathway forward to making policies, if everyone is in agreement that perhaps more regulations of some sort might be useful, and even Senator Cornyn, a Republican from Texas, has said that lately about background checks, for instance, then how is it that in this closely divided sort of public opinion environment can you see a pathway to make those policies?
If I could, for example, I think it's Gallup or Pew, one of the two, says that 96% of Americans support background checks for gun purchases. So, but if you ask someone, do you support gun control, they may not actually understand what that means, because a lot of the message out there is from one side saying they want to take away your guns, and the other side saying, like, guns are the most dangerous thing in the world and everybody's going to get killed if we have more guns. So the extremes on both sides make it so difficult for people to understand what the actual conversation should and is actually about. If someone walks up to me and says, like, do you support gun control and gun safety, I'm going to say yes. And I'm assuming if you ask someone, are you going to support gun safety, you're probably going to say yes. But if you ask them, like, would you support taking away assault weapons, even if you're a gun control proponent, they're gonna say no. The majority of people are going to say no. So I think the biggest part about reaching an agreement is going to have to start at coming to a mutual understanding of what we're trying to do, which I think the four of us have done so far, is said that, like, we want to help save Americans' lives and we want to not infringe on rights. The point where we need to get to is understanding how gun safety plays into that dichotomy, which we haven't been able to get to yet as a nation. But we're working on it. That's what conversations like this are so important.
And about mutual agreements, I think that an area hopefully we could agree on is gun violence restraining orders. Now, if you're on the left, you might not think that this goes far enough, but I think it's something that hopefully you would think it's at least better than nothing. For those of you that don't know about gun violence restraining orders, basically a friend, or I think it's just close relative actually, if they think that their close relative is a danger to themselves or others and they have evidence of that, they can present it to the court and they can take someone's gun rights away for I don't know how long, and as they investigate, but there has to be a high standard of evidence that that person is a danger to themselves or others. If there's not, then that could easily be abused, so we don't want that.
To expand upon that, it can also be people living with the person. So it doesn't just have to be close relative. Like, say, like, I'm going to probably have a roommate for an apartment next year. You know what I mean? If that roommate, even though he's not related to me, if that roommate saw tendencies and had evidence that I was possibly a danger to myself or others, he can take that to a court. And there's factors in place, like if the person's just so increasingly mentally unstable, you know, if they're informed that they're going to have to turn up in court, you know, some people pose the worry of, oh, what's stopping them from just going out and shooting right then? In that case, you could request it's a preliminary hearing or a sped-up hearing in which the trial is organized exceptionally quick within 72 hours. And again, 72 hours is the max. It's good for temporarily taking away the rights of possibly mentally unfit individuals who are going to go about committing an act of violence while also upholding their due process. They have a right to contest the charges. They have a right to know what they're being charged with, who's charging them with what. And in terms of, I guess, restrictions on their Second Amendment rights, in terms of stripping away their Second Amendment rights, it goes from, David French at the National Review actually wrote an article on this. What it usually would go from is 30 days, and then if they're still a threat to themselves or others, which usually if they're a very mentally unstable individual, they would, you just produce some more evidence, 60 days, a year, and it can go on and on and on until that person is no longer in that state of mind. I think that's a really good, regardless of how far you want to go with gun control, my main problem is enforcement. I think that a lot of the policies we have right now aren't being properly enforced, but if you want to make a new policy, I think this is an excellent place to start.
If I could follow up really quick, sorry Savannah, but just on enforcement.
Yeah.
What are some pathways to, because as you point out, we have a lot of laws on the books as it is. It's not as if gun regulations don't exist, right?
Yeah.
So if that's the case, what are some possible pathways that you could envision people who share your political positions seeing more enforcement done?
Well, the problem is there's so many faceless, and I'll get to it. It's just need to lay down the foundation for the problem. The problem is there's so many faceless bureaucrats in government that don't have to be held accountable for their actions. So both state officials, federal officials don't feel the need to necessarily push the information that needs to be put into the NICS background check, which is the FBI instituted background check started in 1998. I almost said 88. And essentially, there's so many faceless bureaucrats in government that a lot of state officials and a lot of federal officials don't report what needs to be reported. What needs to happen is those faceless bureaucrats need to be brought to light. If they fail to report on someone's, violent mental illness, if they fail to report on someone's domestic abuse charges, they should be brought to light, they should be castigated, they should be fired. There should be repercussions for people not fulfilling the responsibilities they're supposed to fulfill. And right now, that's a major problem in our government.
Savannah, you have a thought.
I think the assault weapon, or it's not assault, the weapons restraining order is a great start, but I just have a few questions. Will that person have something on their record, or if they, because what's stopping that person if the government takes their guns away? What's stopping them from buying a gun tomorrow at a new, from a new person or a new federal, or a new gun shop is what I'm trying to say. Is there going to be something on their record that pops up? Because just because their guns were taken away doesn't mean it's not easy. It's not super easy to go tomorrow and buy a gun from another place.
Yeah, so basically their right to purchase a gun would be taken away. So if they had a purchase permit, that would be taken away. If they did not already have a purchase permit and they were trying to get one, then they would not be able to get one.
If they already had firearms, those are going to be temporarily confiscated.
So what's stopping them from buying from a private seller?
All right, okay. There's a few things. First off, and I'm actually looking forward to this. I love the universal background check debate. But when it comes to private sellers, number one, if you have a family member or a close friend who's reporting that person to courts, it's easily assumable that if that person goes out to buy from a private seller, that friend or close family member will certainly know about that and report that person. The second thing is I'd expect local authorities. This is a problem that I see with a lot of government enforcement is government enforcement too often comes solely from the federal level, and we look to the federal government to be big brother and do everything for us. There needs to be a lot of local cooperation, so I would expect the local authorities to keep a close eye on him. And this is why I like tight-knit communities. This is why I like a strong social fabric. I would hope that word would get out through the community and say, this guy just was banned from buying firearms, he's unstable, don't sell him a firearm. The other thing is, and I understand we're going to get to the universal background check debate, but I'll just start with this to be, broad, and then we can get more into it if you want to. A universal background check is just fundamentally unenforceable and ineffective. They've tried it in various in some countries, and it's not possible without a gun registry. And in America, whenever a gun registry is brought up, and this is like when you talk to people about gun control, they'll say common sense gun control. And the people will be like, oh yeah, I'm all for that, common sense. And then you say universal background check, gun registry, and they go, no, never mind. The problem is you're never going to get that legislation passed, and the universal background check is never going to be fully effective or enforceable without a universal background check.
Gun registry.
Or gun registry, sorry. And so that's my basic answer to that.
So if I could, so 2 questions. Would the Democrat representatives be in favor of universal background checks and a gun registry? Because apparently I'm gathering that the Republican representatives would not be.
No.
No, these, okay. So you are in favor of those items or not?
Yes, I on a personal level, and I believe the party as well is in favor of universal background checks. But you're right. But we're not really in favor of a registry, as far as I know. I don't think we talk about that very much. And you're right. It would cause a problem because it would be difficult to enforce. But we don't create laws for the sole purpose of they're going to work every single time. Like, people are going to find ways to get around it. That's what happened whenever you do ban assault weapons. Half the time, gun manufacturers come out and just release a different version of the same gun that adheres to the new laws. The universal background check idea and the on a personal level, I don't even know why you would need to private sales. Like, on a personal level, I think it could move into something, and this is just spitballing. I have no idea if this would work or anything like it, but like, if you want to sell your gun, why don't you sell it to a gun shop that allows used and firearms, and then that gun shop, when they sell it to somebody else, goes through a background check like normal. I understand wanting to be able to sell guns to like friends and family, and I think we could probably make exceptions for something like that, or giving guns. I mean, my dad gave me a gun, so that makes sense to me. But if you're gonna put your gun up on Craigslist, which you actually can't, Craigslist doesn't let you, I don't think. But on an internet site like that, just trying to make a private sale, I don't know why we can't just make that harder. I don't understand why we can allow something like that.
Well, first off, it is illegal to sell over the internet and just make it a private sale. Usually, sales over the over the internet are usually interstate sales, so they have to go through a federally licensed seller. But to the best of my knowledge, even in-state sales, unless you have like an internet forum and you're texting someone and you're like, oh, hey, I'll meet up with you here and we sell the gun. Like,
right.
In that case, yeah. But most internet sales that actually happen on an official site have to go through a background check already. The other problem is, I'm not going to attribute the motive to you that, or I wasn't, that you are for a gun registry. If you are or you're not, I'm just saying there's a difference between hard to enforce and unenforceable. And a universal background check, which also applies to private sales, it's fully unenforceable if you don't have a registry. If you don't have a way to track exactly where that gun is and whose hand it is in at every single moment. And I oppose a registry. The other problem is less than 1% of the guns that are used in crimes come from places like gun shows, where all these private sellers are alleged to gather and sell to people who are mentally unstable or who can't buy a firearm. So not only do I think this would be a totally ineffective policy, it's an unenforceable policy, and also it's a policy that wouldn't apply to most people who commit crimes.
I'm going to have another, I'm sorry to break this up, but I have another question which goes into this. So just as Eric gets excited about talking about universal background, I get excited about talking about federalism, and this is what I'm hearing a lot about. So we have issues because there are federal laws about guns, and then each state has their own laws about guns, and some states have very restrictive gun laws, some states have much looser gun laws. For example, there's the famous example of Chicago and Illinois have relatively tight gun laws, but the problem there is that Chicago is very, very close to Indiana, which has much more open gun laws. There are many fewer regulations there. So dealing with issues like that, could some of these problems be dealt with, and how do we smooth over some of these state-to-state issues that you're describing now, like registries and sales and private gun shows? Like maybe you're not allowed to buy a gun in North Carolina, but you could go somewhere else and buy a gun, right, perhaps?
Yeah.
So how do you deal with issues like that?
Well, listen, here's the thing about federalism is there does need to be some federal or overarching laws, only to assure that each state's individual laws aren't undermined. So the problem is a lot of people say, and again, I'm not making your argument for you, I'm just saying from what I hear most often, a lot of people say that people in Chicago or Illinois, they'll go down to Indiana, they'll go to a gun show, fill a duffel bag with guns, because there's no private or background check on private transactions like there is in Illinois, they get away with it and they drive back up to Illinois and sell those guns to gangs. There's a few problems with that. One, federal law on this matter, 18 U.S. Code 922, Section A, subsection 5, states that if you're engaging in interstate commerce of guns, you have to take that transaction through a federally licensed dealer or get a background check. So that there's already a law covering this. But the other problem is, again, as I stated, less than 1% of guns bought at gun shows or through those private transactions are actually used in an act of crime. And it's very hard to track gang guns. Like, for example, the FBI released a statistic that said 60% of all guns used in Chicago came from out of state. I believe 19 to 20% were from Indiana. The problem is there's also been surveys released and studies released of people who have been able to get in contact with certain gang members who keep their identities secret, or who are former gang members, and they say a majority of their guns don't necessarily come from gun shows. They come through private channels. They come from the black market. They come from straw purchasing, and straw purchasing is where I'll call him an Uncle Rico. It's sometimes the offhand legal term used. So basically, say I'm a gangster, Elise is my Uncle Rico, and I go to Uncle Rico and I say, hey, you have a really clean record, right? How about you go buy me a gun? And Elise goes and buys that gun. She has a clean record, so she passes the background check, and then she brings that gun back to me and just gives it to me. That's highly illegal. You can get sent to jail for a really, really long time for doing that. So the problem is a lot of these laws are already covered, and the proposals that are sometimes put forward, like universal background checks, again, they're just unenforceable and they wouldn't work in the situations. And even if they did, even if they were perfectly effective, the amount of crime they would actually likely stop would be minimal.
I want to push back on that statistic you said a little bit, that only 1%, was it 1%?
Yeah.
Okay. I saw that it was upwards of, it was only like 2 or 3% of guns used in crimes are stolen or acquired illegally. Mm-hmm. And what you're saying is if you buy a gun, if someone buys a gun and gives it to you so you can go commit a crime, like your Uncle Rico example,
yeah,
that is acquired illegally. So I'm wondering where, I mean, I don't know where, I can't off the hand remember where that statistic came from, but I was wondering if you could explain if they don't get them legally or illegally, then how do they get them? And also,
no, I'm saying they get them illegally.
Yeah, I'm saying that they don't, that they get them legally from somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just I'm trying to push back a little bit on that idea that the guns that are used are already purchased illegally, because like we can always go through the talk about the mass shooters and how they always acquire their guns legally. Mm-hmm. Ahead of time, and we can make the argument of whether or not we could have stopped them, like the Cruz or whatever his name was, Parkland.
Yeah.
We can make that argument. We should have been able to stop him ahead of time. Mm-hmm. But someone like I don't like saying their names because they're too famous as it is, but Las Vegas, we should have stopped him too. And then there was the church shoot, he was less likely case. Everybody said he was like completely normal. The Las Vegas shooter, like he was not mentally unstable. He just decided to do this.
How would we stop him?
Because he was in. Well, we can first off we can mitigate damage by banning the bump stocks, which we still haven't been able to do, but everybody says they're okay with it. Or as far as I'm aware, most people have said, like, we're cool with banning bump stocks. Trump said it. Mm-hmm. But yet we can't get the legislation passed. Why can't we get the legislation passed? And then I wish I had done more research into Las Vegas, but why would you need to have that many guns anyway unless you wanted to hurt people or you're a collector? Mm-hmm. And I don't understand how do we draw that line between you're buying so many guns that you are either a collector or you're a danger? Like, how can we decide, how do we know where that is?
Well, I don't even think it's about being a collector versus a danger. Like, I wouldn't consider my uncle a collector of guns. He values the Second Amendment, but he also likes guns. And he has a lot of guns, and I wouldn't say that he wants to hurt people. But why I asked why with the Las Vegas shooters, to the best of my knowledge, and I'll apologize afterwards if I'm wrong, but he was totally legally buying all of those guns. And not just in the sense that we need additional regulations. I mean, he had no criminal background. He bought those guns totally legally. So when I ask how, the problem is you can't legislate away evil. There's always going to be evil people in the world. There's always going to be people trying to utilize their rights for evil things. You can't legislate that away. And it's unfair to say to literally 99.9% of the population, because this one man he was a vile, despicable creature, committed an evil act, we're going to limit your rights. We're going to limit your abilities. I don't think, not only is that not fair, it's just not sensical.
Well, I think that's exactly what we do when we create new laws. We realize that we realize that someone has abused the system. Mm-hmm. We figure out how to keep it from happening again. Taking your shoes off at the airport. That's a nuisance to everybody, and the only reason we have to do it is because one guy tried to do a shoe bomb. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we need to do as a society, is to learn, like, some people are going to abuse this particular power, and we need to figure out how to, and I'm not saying I know how. Please, nobody tell me to write this legislation, because I don't know how to do it. But what I'm saying is, what we need to be able to do is figure out, like, where we decide or how.
Savannah, you wanted to add something?
Yeah.
And this isn't just one guy. I mean, this 2013 statistic, which is pretty outdated, there have been 28 mass shootings since the 2004 ban was over. I mean, this isn't just one guy. This is Pulse nightclub. This is Sandy Hook. This is multiple tragedies happening, and that's why we feel that both parties need to do something. And we're talking about, you're saying universal background checks, they're pointless, basically. And sorry, but I don't find that so, because if just one incident or if a couple lives are saved because of universal, I mean, I don't understand why the Pulse nightclub shooter was on the terrorist watch list and was allowed to go, and what Andy was trying to get between the collectors and the Pulse nightclub shooter went and geared up, and no one was notified, and he was on the terrorist watch list. I mean, that's an issue. Mm-hmm. And I get due process, and I get you don't want to just take someone's rights away, but when someone is on the terrorist watch list and is gearing up for a massacre, I do think there needs to be some type of more comprehensive background check if he passed the instant one. Mm-hmm. And I believe that someone should be notified.
Well, the problem with saying that you shouldn't be able to buy a gun if you're on the terrorist watch list, or if you are on the...
Can I actually answer that one? The problem with not being able to buy a gun because you're on the terrorist watch list is because a lot of people get put on that by accident. Yeah. And it's statistically speaking, you're far more likely to be on that if you're a minority. Mm-hmm. Like the left will push back at the terrorist watch list and say that people get put on that watch list all the time for no other reason than they go to a mosque every day. Like, and that there was an example of a man who was put on the watch list for like 10 years because he donated to what he thought was a charity that was giving scholarships to Afghani college students. And turns out that scholarship fund that he was donating to, and this happens a lot actually, they were donating to this charity, and it turns out that charity was funding terrorism. And so the person that gave the money had no idea, but that guy ends up on the terror watch list for 10 years because of it. Because of that one donation that he made to a charity that he thought was going to do good work, and turns out they were funding terrorists. Was that what you were going to say? Or
pretty much.
Okay.
Not the thing about it being a institutional racism issue. I'm not well versed enough in the terrorist watch list to specifically say, oh no, that's not the case. I'm more worried about also, it's the worry that a lot of people on the right have with the gun registry as well. It's why it's a rather unpopular issue. And you kind of brought this up as well, is it's open to abuse. It's open to, if you have a political opponent that again, this assumes that the government in the future were to turn tyrannical. Not even totally tyrannical, just in the sense that it wants to start stifling some rights. If you're a political dissident, if you're someone the government doesn't like, and you kind of implied this by saying that they put people of racial minority status on that list for pretty much no good reasons, or they don't have the context, they can put you on that list and keep you from buying a firearm. So it's just a system that's very open to abuse, and it's the same thing, even though one's government, one's more private industry. It's the same problem with people saying we should legislate and we should ban people from buying who are on the no-fly list. I mean, I forget his name, but I think there was a Democratic congressman who was on the no-fly list for a long time. And despite me not agreeing with him, I wouldn't say that he's a mentally unstable individual who's going to go shoot up the nightclub or anything.
There's been toddlers on the list as well.
Exactly. So I just
people who make the mistake of just having the wrong name,
or even a similar sounding name even.
I do want to say though that the no-fly list is a heuristic. Mm-hmm. Like, it's and then the terrorist watch list. Those are heuristics to give us an idea. I think maybe we should look at those people that are on the list more closely.
I agree.
Than the general public. Like, the Orlando shooter should not have been able to get those, and it should be because you shouldn't have to pass a 10-second background check to walk in and buy a rifle.
Mm-hmm.
Like, when I got my gun permit, it took me less than 24 hours to get my gun permit, and I hear from most people that that's really fast. But it was 24 hours. That's all it took, and granted, that's because I have a clean record. Mm-hmm. But the point, but if you want to go in and buy a rifle, which the problem is right now, is that a bolt action like 30-06 is the same background check as a AR-15 or a Sig Sauer MCX. It's the same background check, but two very different and vastly more, and one is vastly more dangerous and deadly than the other. And the whole point of, I think, when people are talking about how we need to legislate, when people say assault weapons and high capacity, high volume like weapons, is that like these guns like the AR-15, the Sig Sauer, the guns that I'm describing now, they were built for the sole purpose of being able to kill as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. And that when they were designed as fully automatics, that's what it was. And then as they got shifted into the civilian market, they got rid of the option to turn on fully automatic fire, and they're just semi-automatic weapons now. But that does not limit their lethality. They're still far too lethal, in my opinion, to be owned by a private person, because there's no point. The whole point of
Go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
Are you saying the semi-automatic one?
The semi-automatic version.
I mean, like, okay, if you're talking about like an AR-15, for example, even though that looks a lot different than, say, my handgun, it still functions the same way. Each time you pull the trigger, another bullet goes into the chamber. For each trigger pull, it's only one bullet. So I don't think there's a huge difference in lethality.
Well, the way that I describe it, by lethality, I mean ability to kill as many people as possible in as little amount of time, because the guns like the AR-15, and I'm just going to say AR-15, and I hope everyone understands that I'm referring to guns of that type, based on an AR style. They were created in order to go through and clear rooms as quickly as possible. They were created to hit a target and maim, so that your buddies will come out and try to help that person, so then you can pick them off more. They were created to kill human beings as effectively as possible. Well, as a handgun has personal defense attributes to it. You can conceal it and keep it on your person to protect yourself from someone who's trying to hurt you. Shotguns are perfect for home defense and for duck hunting and stuff like that. And then your traditional, what I would consider a hunting rifle, or not a modern sporting rifle, is more for your deer and your boar and stuff like that. Like, I just think, from a personal standpoint, like this is not the view of the party as far as I imagine, is that these guns, we need to have more limits on them than we do a traditional hunting rifle or a shotgun.
So why was the Second Amendment instituted? I want to know your take, because I do want to know where to argue from, because I just want to get a full view of your position.
Well, I completely agree with your view of the Second Amendment. It was created to protection of the people from everyone, including other people and a possibly tyrannical government. Mm-hmm. I think personally that we've shifted away from the view. I think that was the way it was formed, and but I don't think that the entire populace is considered a well-regulated militia.
Well-regulated militia doesn't mean necessarily. What do you think well-regulated militia means?
Well, to me, a well-regulated militia is more like the National Guard.
Okay, that's not what it means in the case of the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment means, when it says well-regulated militia, if you take, and this is why it's, and this isn't on you, it's why it's so complicated to debate the Constitution sometimes, because there were words, it's not even just the underlying message. It's that words meant differently back then than what they do today. So today when you see well-regulated militia, you think essentially a well-regulated force, right? Or something like the National Guard. what well-regulated militia meant back then was any able-bodied man who was able to use a firearm. That's what well-regulated militia meant. The people were the well-regulated militia, and you can comb through the statements of the Founding Fathers. The Second Amendment was meant for individual use. It was meant for individual rights. That's why, and amongst Federalists and anti-Federalists alike, that was the common conception of the Second Amendment. So you can disagree with that, but a well-regulated militia does not necessarily mean a state force.
Well, I was going to, that's what I believe a militia means, is like the people. Like, where I draw the comparison is well-regulated. Mm-hmm. Like, and then that's why the Constitution is still a living document, because we can have arguments like this and no one's really sure what the answer is. The point is, the well-regulated part is what gets me. Yeah. As our technology changes and as our view of the problem changes, and we should look at the Constitution in that new light. And I'm sorry, Savannah, what were you gonna say? Oh, I'm done. So.
And I think if we're taking it literal word for word, what the Founding Fathers meant, I mean, we can talk about what weapons they were talking about. They were not talking about the technology of weapons we're talking about right now. So do their words change with time, or do we take that literal word for word and just ignore the fact that we're not talking about muskets anymore?
If the Founding Fathers said you had a specific right to a musket, they would have said you had a specific right to a musket. Because the Constitution is a very intricate document. There were debates, I forget which amendment this was with, but there was something like a 5-hour, 6-hour debate between the Founding Fathers on where they should place a comma. If they specifically meant that all you were allowed to have, because muskets weren't the only weapon of the day, there were various weapons, I can't think of them off the top of my head, but there were various weapons that were, by the way, far more advanced than the common musket that they thought the people were allowed to own. Not only that, but if we're talking about muskets, the fact that the Second Amendment, the philosophical belief behind the Second Amendment, is it's a contract breaker. It's Lockean theory in the sense that when the consent of the people is violated, when the social contract is broken, the people have a right to, since the social contract's broken, turn against the tyrannical government that has turned against them. And it comes from a sole belief that government is not the giver of rights, it is the protector of rights. But when we talk about the Second Amendment and the fact that its philosophical root is to oppose, not just self-preservation, that's a part of it, but to oppose a tyrannical government if it were to go rogue, I would assume that, and not even assume, I would say that the Founding Fathers would want the people to have almost a weapon capacity that is well enough to hold off a tyrannical government. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm saying, let's legislate all fully automatic weapons, but I am saying that it's not just saying you have a right to a musket. It's saying you have a right to properly protect yourself from that tyranny. And that's my, sole basis there.
So if I may interject one more. One thing that some of you have touched on quite a bit over the course of our time together, and we do have about 10 more minutes. So this will be my last question. If we have a few minutes at the end of this, we might try to get a question or two from the crowd. But one of the things that we've talked about are some of the mass shooting events that have happened around the United States more recently. And so if you look, and I did a little bit of research this afternoon, and I think according to what I saw is that since Columbine in 1999, and I focused on schools specifically because we're on a college campus, and we just this week had a walkout of students across the country on this topic, right, for this purpose actually. And my question is it important that this conversation seems to pop up whenever there's a mass shooting event? And to what extent do the media have a role to play in fomenting this sort of the constant, back and forth in this kind of debate in a way? Because it seems like there's a lot of, just as my impression, you may disagree, it seems like there is a fair bit of agreement on some conditions here. So what is the role of the media here? And my second thing is, given that, we'll just start there. Like, is the media responsible for some of the seeming bickering where there might be more agreement than we might otherwise think sometimes?
In the media, there's the age-old saying, if it bleeds, it leads. Like, so every time there's a tragedy, the media is going to focus all of its energy on it because that's what drives up the ratings, because everybody wants to know what's happening. And honestly, I'm glad that we live in a society where everybody cares enough to try and watch the news to know what's happening around our country, and that if a tragedy happens, I'm glad that people watch the media so that they can know what's going on. The point of the media has become that or one of the problems is that the pundits they use are the ones that are going to be the most entertaining to watch. They use pundits that are going to disagree with each other, because if they used two people that agreed, it wouldn't be very fun to watch. They would be sitting there saying, oh yeah, you know, that's a good point. Instead, they want to grab people that are as far one way or another, so that no matter what happens, no one's going to come to an agreement on that program. They don't want people to come up with solutions on the program live, because what they want you to do is sit there and watch. So that's why things like the legislature are on C-SPAN and not usually anywhere else, because that's where actual work gets done, and it's not on the media. And one of the things that I have a problem with is the fact that we do only talk about gun control and gun safety and the rights, the Second Amendment. No one's talking about any of that stuff when it's not in the headlines. And that's one of the things that I don't like. I think we need to be talking about this all the time. I think that this needs to be a conversation that doesn't stop. That's how we're going to reach change. Because if we have conversations directly after a shooting, half of the people that are talking about it, and this is from both sides, they're gonna offer their thoughts and prayers, and they're gonna move on. Then the other half is gonna be so emotionally charged because they feel like we have to get something done right now or nothing will ever get done. Then they can't come to an agreement either, because nobody's thinking with level heads. Mm-hmm. So we need to have a conversation. The problem is we have so many mass shootings now that it's like they're constantly in the news because they're constantly happening. But that's a whole different problem. Eric, you were going to say something? I'm sorry.
I'll blame the media for one thing. I don't think it's a problem that we're bickering. And not only do I not think it's a problem, I don't think it's a media-caused problem. Do I think the media exacerbates that problem? Sure. Do I think it's a problem inherently caused by the media? No. The American public has always been heavily polarized. And beyond that, after a shooting happens, there's a lot of pain going around. You sympathize with the people that were killed. You sympathize with the families that lost a loved one. You sympathize with the community that they have to grieve those people. I mean, regardless of what you believe on gun control, you feel bad for those people. You genuinely feel sympathy for those people. And what happens is sometimes that sympathy, that sadness can turn to anger. It can turn to resentment. It can turn to, why haven't you done X, Y, and Z? Well, why are you why are you doing X, Y, and Z? So it's not a major issue that the media is exacerbating. We'd be bickering either way. Or it's an issue that the media is exacerbating, but we'd be bickering either way. The thing that I do blame on the media is, I think everyone can have some sort of, like when we're talking about, legal resolutions to help stop mass shooters. Let's talk about social resolutions to stop mass shooters. There have been various studies that show that when you show the name, the face of the shooter on TV, and I praise you, the fact that you did this earlier in the debate, that you won't name the disgusting pieces of filth that commit these acts. When your face is broadcast all over the news, when your name is broadcast all over the news, not only do mentally disturbed individuals, people who would be willing to be violent, take homage from that. They worship that individual. They want to be like that individual. Sometimes people do it mentally in their mental delusion. They do it to go down in history. And there's been various studies that show that this kind of practice exacerbates the problem of mass shootings. So if the media wanted to solve a problem right off the bat, or not even solve a problem, but help remedy the problem right off the bat, they could stop naming shooters. And that's what I like. Ben Shapiro's Daily Wire started doing it. They stopped naming shooters. They stopped showing their faces. He doesn't talk about them on his podcast anymore. Regardless of what you think about the Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro, how to the right he is, that is a good thing. And that's a thing that left and right the media needs to start doing.
Well, that's another... sorry.
Well, I know CNN, fake news, right? They do not mention the shooters' names. I know they stopped doing that about, I don't know how many shootings ago. But I do want to say that I'm not mad at the media. I'm a big fan of the First Amendment as well, and I believe this is the media's job. It's their responsibility to hold us accountable, to hold our officials accountable, and the media should be talking about it. They should be discussing it, and if it's entertainment to some people or news to another, that's on you. But I don't think there's any better time to talk about mass shootings. I mean, yes, it's always a good time to talk about it, but we're not going to not talk about it because it happened. We're not going to be quiet because we're offering thoughts and prayers. We're also going to be talking about solutions and ways we can work on solutions. I think the media is simply doing their job, and that is to report the news and how the American people feel. And just because the American people feel kind of out of whack or however they feel, the media is doing their job. So I'm not mad at the media. I'm glad that the issues are being talked about. I'm glad that all these people in this room know about the issue of gun safety, and because of whatever news outlet you watch, someone is reporting it. This conversation is happening, and this conversation needs to continue to happen, and we need to also appreciate the First Amendment, Second Amendment, all our amendments. We're Americans. Yeah.
Elise, did you have something?
No.
Okay, so one question for each side, because the Republicans got the first one. I'll go with Democrats first this time. Last question, and then I want you to, Savannah and Elise, to tell us when your meetings are, so those who want to attend the meetings can find out and come talk to these folks and be involved. But first things, if the college Democrats at UNCW could see one thing done for on the Second Amendment or gun control, take your framing of your choice, then what would it be? One thing.
My one thing, and I hope that Savannah would agree with me, is something we didn't really touch on today, which is magazine capacity. I think the easiest way to mitigate mass shootings, which is something everybody talks about now, is to limit magazine capacities. That's what I would like to see. To start, that would be a nice start.
Could I respond to that?
Well, yeah. Well, just what's the one thing you would like to see done
Okay.
as a Republican?
Well, I don't know. We might not agree.
That's fine.
It's
Oh,
fine.
okay, I'll give my opinion.
I'll just roast you.
It's
It's fine.
I would like to get rid of gun-free zones, especially on college campuses. I think there's a reason why 98%, I think it's from 1952, 98% of mass shootings are on gun-free zones. It's because they're an easy target. No one's going to be there to shoot back at you. So.
How dare you?
Savannah, you have one more comment?
It's just when we talk about adding more guns to the situation, America has the most guns out of pretty much anyone, and we still have this problem. So I'm just not sure if more guns are going to help, but I think trained professionals on campuses will help. Security guards, officers, people who are trained with weapons, not teachers.
Okay, so that's interesting. So Savannah got to respond, so at least you get to respond to Andy.
Okay. So, I'd rather respond to Savannah's comment.
Oh, okay,
I
that's
love
fine.
talking about
Just
gun-free
response.
zones.
Just one more response, and then we're going to close it up.
Well, you said that it would be more guns. It wouldn't be more guns. It would just be allowing people that already have their concealed carry permit to have them on campus. And I think it was the Crime Prevention Research Center that found that concealed carry permit holders are actually the most law-abiding people in the United States.
So I will have to close it at that. But I'd like to thank the groups. Before we go, college Republicans, when are your meetings? College,
7 on Wednesdays in Lutzy 136.
and college Democrats?
We meet in Lutzy 138 every Tuesday at 6 o'clock, and we'd really like for you to be there and help us decide this issue.
So thank you all for being here. I'm sorry we didn't have any questions or comments. Thank you. Thank you so much.